The background and context of the proposed referendum to recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution and establish an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Indigenous Australians are the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have lived on this land for more than 60,000 years. They are the first peoples of Australia, but they are not mentioned in the Australian Constitution, the document that sets out the rules and principles of how the country is governed. The Constitution was written in 1901 by white men who did not consider Indigenous Australians as equal citizens. In fact, the original Constitution excluded them from being counted in the national census and gave the federal parliament power to make laws for any race except Aboriginal people. This meant that Indigenous Australians were subject to discriminatory laws and policies made by state governments, such as being denied the right to vote, own land, receive education, or practice their culture. In 1967, after a decade of campaigning by Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists, a referendum was held to change the Constitution and remove these two clauses that discriminated against Indigenous Australians. The referendum was supported by nearly 91% of voters, a record high in Australian history. It was seen as a landmark moment for Indigenous rights and recognition. However, the 1967 referendum did not grant Indigenous Australians any special status or representation in the Constitution. It also did not address the historical injustices and dispossession that they had suffered since colonisation. Many Indigenous Australians continue to face social and economic disadvantages, such as lower life expectancy, higher rates of poverty, poor health, incarceration, and suicide. In 2008, the federal government issued a formal apology to the stolen generations, the Indigenous children who were forcibly removed from their families and communities by government policies between 1910 and 1970. The apology was a significant step towards reconciliation, but it did not include any compensation or reparations for the harm caused. In 2015, the federal government initiated a process of consultation with Indigenous Australians on constitutional recognition. This process culminated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017, a document that expressed the aspirations and demands of Indigenous Australians for a fair and truthful relationship with the rest of the nation. The Uluru Statement called for 3 reforms: a First Nations voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution, a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement-making between governments and First Nations, and truth-telling about their history. The First Nations Voice to Parliament is a proposed body that would represent Indigenous Australians to the federal parliament and government on matters relating to their rights and interests. The voice would not have any legislative or executive power, but it would have the ability to make submissions, provide advice, and influence policy on issues affecting Indigenous Australians. The voice would be composed of members chosen by Indigenous Australians themselves, and it would reflect their diversity and regional differences.